Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be all together. We have already started informal conversation, and we don't need a solution of continuity to move from what we were discussing to the important content. I have to repeat what was just said. Please mute your microphones. And I want to inform that we will open the debate with the public in 1 hour. And I invite the audience to intervene by raising their hand or by signaling in any way, maybe in the chat, or writing question in the chat. So I want to welcome Sally Schwartz, which is the founding partner of Arthus Wise Law Firm, which is based in Paris. She has particular expertise in advising African governments regarding the negotiation of their extractive industry permits and agreement. To salute also Ian Steele, which is an independent economist and strategy consultant, research associate at the Overseas Development Institute, the ODI. He currently advises the government of Liberia on negotiating contracts for natural resources concession and the taxation of natural resources company. Howard Mann, good morning or night or afternoon, which is a senior international law advisor for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He's also a senior advisor to the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, and Sustainable Development. Anna Tiwes, Global Tax Policy Manager at Shell International. She's a frequent contributor to the United Nations and the OECD tax database on international tax and climate change related tax matters. By the way, in this moment itself, there is the meeting of the tax forum here. Good morning to Michael Florent Okoko, Permanent Secretary of the National Committee and Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the AITI. Is advisor to the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, and a member of the EITI board. Peter Leon, partner and Africa co-chair of the Herbert Smith Freehills Law Firm, is based in Johannesburg, and his expertise includes, among other things, resources nationalism, mineral and petroleum regulation in developing countries, including international best practices. I want to say hello also to the moderator, Lara Liberti, which is the head of the Natural Resources for Development Unit at the OECD Development Center and responsible for the multi-stakeholder process that lead to the development of the guiding principle for durable extractive contracts as part of the policy dialogue that she has created on natural resource-based developments work stream on getting better deals. So where are we now? We have heard that we are in different places, but we are together digitally. Where we are in what we call the DevTalks, Reshaping Development series, and in particular in one of the pillars, the green transition. Let me say a few words about it just for you to know. We have a series of DevTalks in the Development Center. They are called Reshaping Development. You have known Sophia Shaloya, which is the person that is behind all of it. And the aim is to look at post-COVID future moving from adversity to opportunity. We want to redefine the elements, the blueprints that we need to rebuild inclusive and sustainable society, and if possible, different from those before the crisis of COVID that were not performing so greatly. I want to specify in particular that this DevTalk is the first, congratulations, of the green transition pillar in our DevTalks. Just to give you an idea what they are, the most recent one we had one on debt, in particular in Africa, but not only. We had Carlos Lopez with us, we had Jose Antonio Ocampo, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, and Abebe Selassie, which is the head of the African desk of the IMF, as I presume many of you know. Another one we just had was about regional, macro-regional development. We had Ibrahim Mayaki, Alicia Barsena, Anita Prakash, the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. So these are opportunities where we get together and we discuss an important issue. Don't hesitate to follow us also about other subjects, but thank you for opening this first stream on development. Let me introduce the guiding principle for durable extractive contracts that mark, under my point of view, an important achievement for the OECD Development Center that I have the honor to direct, and the development community as a whole. I think for three reasons in particular. Unlike unbalanced contracts that are not sustainable, the guiding principle addresses the difficult question of how to negotiate a fair deal for governments, investors, and communities in a sustainable way for all, facilitating good development outcomes. The second is I want to thank the endorsement by the Development Center's Governing Board. The guiding principle are an unprecedented tool reflecting the common ground reached by 56 members of the Development Center, of which only 27 are OECD countries. And 29 are full members of the center, but are developing and emerging economies across different regions. To name a few, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru in Latin America, or Ivory Coast, Ghana, Senegal, South Africa in Africa, or China, Kazakhstan, India, Indonesia, Vietnam. These are members of the Development Center in Asia and in the other continent. They have approved those principles, whose value, therefore, in a certain sense, goes beyond what the OECD can approve. This shows how the OECD Development Center, with its unique membership, can provide a policy forum with equal participation from a diversity of countries, but all with the same voice. This was the reason why John Fitzgerald Kennedy created the Development Center of the OECD, to build consensus and develop innovative approaches to development challenges. So here we are, and our man is Anna and Michael and Peter Leon are starting our discussion with Sally and Jan, and I would give now the floor to Lara, but specifying the third reason why I think that these guiding principles are important. They are the product of a collaborative effort by government, civil society, experts, and international organizations. We can say that the multi-stakeholder process is an achievement in itself. And DEV played a crucial role in bridging the divide between the different positions. So not only between different countries that usually we classify in different categories, developed, non-developed, high income, middle, low income, and so on, but also between different actors. Therefore, and I pass the floor to Lara Liberti to more specific and technical introduction remarks to this meeting. Thank you and welcome. Lara?
Thank you very much, Mario, for this introduction. And I'd like to address in my remarks three main points to provide a bit more detail on the process, how the guiding principles were developed. Then address the question of why getting better deals in extractives matter for sustainable development. And then try to elaborate on how can extractive contracts withstand the test of time. With respect to the first point, how the guiding principles were developed, I'd like to acknowledge the suggestion made by South Africa back in 2015 to identify the key attributes of durable extractive contracts. This suggestion was welcomed by participants in the fourth plenary meeting of the Policy Dialogue in December 2015, where governments from OECD and non-OECD countries, industry and civil society agreed to pursue a dialogue on how extractive exploration and production contracts can be designed to withstand the test of time. Subsequently, on the 3rd of October 2017, the members of the Governing Board of the OECD Development Center, meeting at high level, encouraged the OECD Development Center to develop through an open and inclusive participatory process and building on the experience of relevant international initiatives, guiding principles for durable extractive contracts so that host governments and investors can have a common reference to shape durable, equitable, and mutually beneficial relationship. In line with the mandate received by the Governing Board, the guiding principles were co-produced by a diverse group of stakeholders between December 2015 and June 2019, involving subject matter experts from governments, industry, civil society, and international organizations who were able to come together and stay engaged over a long period of time, find common ground on some often very sensitive and contentious issues. Earlier drafts of the guiding principles were discussed during various teleconferences, workshops, discussions in plenary, and benefited from input received through an online public consultation. Why getting better deals in extractives matter for sustainable development? Because extractive contracts not only shape the level of public revenues that government get out of the investment, but also the extent to which such investments create income generating opportunities through employment and linkages with the local economy. Contracts also shape the balance between these economic benefits and social and environmental aspects, with significant long-term impacts on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Contracted decisions are thus critical to get good development outcomes, and getting the contract right is therefore key to minimizing the risks of undermining the achievement of development objectives, attract investors, and fully seize the opportunities created by natural resource-based development. How can extractive contracts withstand the test of time? In order for extractive contracts to be sustainable in the long term, it is essential that they reflect a balanced situation that recognizes all of the host country's interest to develop its resources in pursuit of many layered development objectives, communities' interest to optimize local benefits, and also address any adverse social and environmental impacts, and investors' need to be rewarded for the risks incurred and the allocation of financial and organizational resources. The guiding principles set out 8 principles that provide guidance on how resource projects can be developed to reflect the balance of risks and rewards which underpins durable contracts, while taking into account since the very beginning community interests and concerns. They offer a blueprint for the content and negotiation of durable contracts, which can reduce the drivers of renegotiation and can provide adaptable and flexible provisions, which, for example, can automatically adjust to prevailing market conditions. They also aim at assisting host governments and investors in explaining the content of the contract to the public, thereby helping to overcome tensions between stakeholders. The guiding principles are pretty unique in the sense that they address the following key challenges arising from complex contract negotiations: the tension between the adoption of a long-term perspective and the pursuit of short-term gains in extractive contract negotiations on both sides of the table, social conflicts around extractive projects, internalization of externalities with costs of environmental and social impacts factored into the economic balance of the contract, asymmetry of information between the negotiating parties, how to deal with non-fiscal changes in law without recurring to stabilization, and how to avoid fiscal instability. This is the menu of issues that we will be addressing today, reflecting the provisions contained in the guiding principle. Let me briefly address the first challenge, the tension between the long-term perspective and the pursuit of short-term gains on both sides of the negotiating table. A long-term perspective should prevail over short-term gains, as reflected in Guiding Principle 1. The lack of a long-term perspective on both sides of the negotiating table has often been the source of strained relationships between the contracting parties. Pressure for short-term gains may arise from both the government and investors and needs to be carefully handled. Guiding Principle 1 recommends that host governments need first to determine what strategies and national and local development objectives they want to achieve with their natural resource endowments. And this is the vision they want and need to pursue, and how they wish to achieve such goals, the strategy they need to elaborate and implement. While ownership of the vision should reside in government to ensure clear accountability, the governance of the development of the strategy should be more inclusive and involve national and local government, as well as non-governmental stakeholders, including local communities and investors, to build buy-in since the very beginning. In order to be durable, extractive contracts should reflect an equitable balance between the host government's long-term vision, integrating the concerns of local community and the legitimate interests of investors. And the goals of this long-term vision should inform the government's objectives in the negotiations and need to be properly reflected in the terms and conditions of the contract, under which the investor will operate to help long-term interests prevail over short-term ones. I alluded to the second challenge, which is how to address the social conflicts around extractive projects. Such social conflicts are often generated and associated with adverse environmental and social impacts. I would like to call on Sally Schwartz to share with us how the guiding principles can help manage the expectations of all stakeholders throughout the life cycle of the project, and also address environmental and social impacts. Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to read to you, I hope that it will be on your screens shortly, Guidance Principle 2. I think before I do that, it's very interesting to note that the first 4 guiding principles are aimed at getting to a good equitable balance between the goals of each of the participants in these talks and negotiations. So the guiding principle 2, what does it say? It says durable extractive contracts are anchored in a transparent, constructive, long-term commercial relationship, an operational partnership between host governments, investors, and communities to fulfill agreed and understood objectives based on shared and realistic expectations that are managed throughout the life cycle of the project. I think the key words here in Guiding Principle 2 that I would like to point out to everyone that's listening and watching are the shared and realistic expectations and objectives. No contract for a life of a project for an extractive material will ever survive if we don't meet the objectives of all the parties concerned. Investors will look to the long-term profit and return on investment. Host governments will look for a broad national development objectives, as well as securing a fair share of income. And civil society, those that are affected by the project, both in their immediate vicinity and larger regional projects, They look for improvements in their lives, such as water, access to water, electricity, farmland, schools, hospital, transportation hubs, such as railroads, and the like. Now, how do we get to where we want to go to be? We need a contract that reflects the realistic objectives and expectations of the parties. Well, how do you do this? Before the contracts are ever signed, when they're being negotiated, I think it is essential for each party to identify both internally and communicate to the other parties its objectives. Host governments need to focus on what they need and want to get out of this contract. Companies and investors, they need to look at what their rate of return is going to be and how they're going to achieve that whilst respecting both of the government's objectives and the communities. Every party needs to manage its expectations with the other party's expectations. The goal here is, if people are really speaking to each other and sharing expectations and objectives, then we will build trust through the process of talking, negotiating, and ending up with a contract that reflects an understanding of the needs and requirements of all the other parties involved in the contract, as well as the consequences of that project. No contract will ever be survivable for more than 3 to 5 years if we rush into negotiations and sign contracts where one party has an unequal part in the contract. I think it is essential to focus on the communities involved and how this project is going to affect them. And the only way to do this is the government, the investor, the operating partner, if it's not the same as the investor, and the communities need to be able to discuss the effects of the contract and how this will affect, in the very beginning of the contract, even in the exploration phase and the feasibility stage, how this is going to affect them. I would like now to move on to principle 3, if you mind putting that on the screen, so we can discuss the guiding principle 3. Now that we have looked at guiding principle 2, which looks at shared and realistic objectives and expectations, guiding principle 3 talks about balancing interests. It says durable extractive contracts balance the legitimate interests of host governments, investors, and communities, with due account taken, where relevant, of the specific rights of affected indigenous peoples recognized under applicable international and/or national law. All right, so what do we have here? We have a guiding principle that is telling us that we need to balance everyone's interests. So how do we do this? We must seek, when looking at contracts before, during, and during their entire life cycle, seek and align the common interests that we can find between the parties. What does this mean? That means we need to extract the value for all the parties, the investor, the government, the local communities, maintain good relationships amongst all the parties concerned, respect the environment and the local peoples who live near the project, and maintain a long-term partnership, which in fact is for finite resources, which will disappear. What does this mean? Why are we talking about affected indigenous peoples? The reason that this guiding principle number 3 is so very important is because who is living on the land? Who is living around the project's perimeters, and in fact, often in the land that the project is going to involve, take over, expropriate, depending upon how the government, the investor, and the local communities discuss these issues. We need to protect fragile peoples and the environment. As Lara pointed out earlier in her introduction and her discussion of principle number 1, when problems arise regarding the community's rights and needs, this can totally sabotage a project if their rights and their needs are not taken into consideration at the very, very beginning when the government puts out a tender for a project license, permit, or however each government deals with awarding exploration licenses to investors and operating companies. We need to look at how to manage the perceptions of risk and opportunities with reality, because sitting in an office isn't going to help look at the different risks involved and the different opportunities, which could be lost very early in a project if attention is not being paid to these opportunities. This means that feasibility studies must be done, environmental and social impact studies and statements must be looked into, shared and examined, financial simulations of investors and operating companies in the best scenario and best practices will be shared with governments so that governments can see what the expectations are of the investors, as well as governments which probably need to share their financial expectations and the structures which other panelists will discuss later, the structures they are going to use to manage their revenue coming out of the project. What is needed here is balance and negotiating those interests which will unavoidably diverge. There will be competing interests over different timelines during the life of the project. We need to balance the risks of the investor, which will be putting in a lot of money in the very beginning of the project and which will not get many returns, if any, until commercial production. So we need to balance the investor and the operating company's risks, their investment, with the risks of the local communities who often are found dispossessed of their land, lacking water, lacking any type of good places to live. And so we have to look at whose interests are being served at what point of the project and look at them and see how they will even out over time. Who is willing to be patient and who is not? How do we balance these interests in an equitable manner, in a manner that is fair? We have to evaluate the risks to all the parties. And of course, and this is something that is rarely done and should be done systematically, everyone needs to factor in the additional costs which could arise in the event of adverse social and environmental impacts. Now, some things cannot be avoided. In the legal community, we call those force majeure, but they can be taken into account in contractual negotiations and in the contractual clauses. A lot of times when something like that, something that is unavoidable and unforeseeable, parties have to come back to the negotiating table. And of course, one should always keep in mind the international and national laws that protect Indigenous peoples from unfair expropriation, from throwing them out from their lands and not taking into consideration the government needs of development, which they are in the front line of. So that is what, in my mind, Principle 3 is all about. And now I would ask that we go to Guiding Principle 4. Guiding Principle 4, which will speak to another main issue here, it reads as follows. Durable extractive contracts seek to optimize the value from resource development for all stakeholders, including economic, social, and environmental outcomes. So what does this mean? This means that the contract needs to identify the roles and responsibilities of the main parties, which are the government, which needs to identify development goals and needs to have early engagement with the protection of communities, as well as revenue management tools. The government is responsible. This is the national government, the regional government, and the local government need to identify the development goals and talk and listen to, and mostly listen to, the communities. This is a communication goal which is often overlooked and creates havoc later on in the project. The investor's roles and responsibilities are to carry out, often with feasibility studies, to do a cost risk analysis, to identify investment costs, rate of return, and absolutely must analyze adverse environmental and social impacts and the evaluation of potential contributions to the country. And this analysis is usually both internal within the investor and external with the government. And then we have the community, which unfortunately is often ignored. And this community must identify with the national and regional governments, the goals of the local community, and how it can safeguard its rights, and how to manage consultations. This talk is a bit too short for us to get into consultations and informed consent, but perhaps that will be another day and another talk. But the idea here is that communities must be involved in identifying and learning about the goals of the government, the national government, the regional government, and the governments, national and regional, must listen to the community, safeguard its rights, and help it identify tools so that they will be adequately, fairly, have informed consent to whatever the project needs to have, the investment that we're talking about. The second goal of this principle is to seek the optimization of value and the creation of opportunities. Now, how do we do this? Well, the government needs to balance revenue management tools with environmental and human rights protection. These are words, but they need to be put into practice. The investor needs to look at value-added contributions. Should the investor be involved in contributing to the community? I think the answer is, of course it should. Should the investor be involved in transforming minerals and hydrocarbon extractives into projects which will add value added to the country in terms of training, in terms of local employment, and in terms of added revenue streams? And finally, each of these actors in this life cycle of the project needs to manage potential adverse impacts, both on the government and on the social impact. What does this mean? It means that environmental baseline studies must be done, that we must have in each project an environmental disaster prevention plan and a fund management plan to meet environmental disasters. And this needs to be discussed with revenue management and with the governments and the communities. And the communities need to have their development plans and to manage them with funds that will be coming out of the revenue. Finally, least but not least, remediation plans must be put in place in the beginning of the project and not at the end by both the government, the community, and the investor operator. This goes back to the Ruggie principles, which are important: protect the communities and the obligations of the investors and the operators of the project and the communities, and how we can help remediate any adverse aspects. And with that, I'm happy to stop my introduction of the third and fourth principle, hand the microphone back to Lara, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we continue the dialogue. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Sally, for explaining so clearly this difficult balancing exercise, and also the challenge to keep a continuous alignment of interests across governments, industry, and communities as the backbone of durable extractive contracts and what this entails in practice. Let's move to the second challenge that I mentioned in the introduction, how to deal with asymmetry of information. We all know that governments and investors come to the table with a different degree of information and also bargaining power in some instances. And that during negotiations, the absence or limited availability of information on the value of the resources, including their quantity, quality, price, costs, affects the ability to determine the size of future benefits. So there are both risks and uncertainties that need to be taken care of during the negotiation and also during the life cycle of the project. So I'd like to ask Jan Steele to elaborate on how the guiding principles can help the negotiating parties address the risks, uncertainty, and asymmetry of information that ordinarily exists between investors and governments at both the negotiation stage and throughout the life cycle of the contract. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world today. A few years ago, I started working with the Overseas Development Institute and the CONNEX initiative to advise the government of Liberia on several contract negotiations in the mining sector. At that stage, there were several investors who had reached sort of an advanced stage of exploration in iron ore and gold mines and were looking to negotiate development agreements to bring the asset into production. And in Liberia and other countries I've worked in, you usually hear from investors one or all of three things. Firstly, it's a sort of risky country. Secondly, the infrastructure is not very good. And thirdly, the asset's not very good. And therefore, we need tax incentives to make this commercially viable. And the problem that governments face is they lack the data and information needed to sort of validate those claims and to do their own assessments of the commercial viability of a project, look at the impact of tax incentives as one example, and to come to a sort of informed decision on whether or not to agree to these things. And what we've done in the countries I've worked in is we've insisted that investors share with the government feasibility studies and financial models and empower the government to do its own analysis so that we can reach agreements that are balanced and that meet the legitimate aims of investors, governments, and local communities, as Mario mentioned earlier. And I think for investors, there can be a temptation really to withhold information and data and believe that in doing so, that's a sort of source of strength in negotiations. And the problem with that approach is you tend to end up then with unbalanced agreements, and down the line, those agreements will unravel because one of the three parties will be unsatisfied with the outcomes. And you therefore end up back at the negotiation table in a costly renegotiation, or worse, the project fails altogether. And for that reason, I'm really pleased to see Guiding Principle 5. And what Guiding Principle 5 says is durable extractive contracts are negotiated and based on the continued sharing in good faith of key financial and technical data to build a common understanding of the performance, main risks and opportunities of the project through its life cycle. And I think the, excuse me, I think if you look in more detail on what the guiding principles say in the notes, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that natural resource projects are inherently risky and uncertain. Nobody knows in advance the final financial, economic, environmental, and social outcomes. So all parties are dealing in an environment of high uncertainty. As Lara said, we don't know in advance the actual quantity and quality of the resource that's going to be developed. We don't know for certain the investment that will be required to develop the assets and the operating costs that will be incurred to extract and exploit resources. And we certainly don't know the future path of commodity prices. In fact, the one thing we do know about commodity prices is that they are highly volatile and difficult to forecast. We see these sort of long boom and bust cycles, but also a huge amount of short-term volatility. A good example of this is I think nobody would have foreseen this time last year that West Texas International Oil would briefly trade in negative territory. So it's very difficult to forecast commodity prices, and that has a big bearing on the financial impact, financial outcomes of projects. However, investors do have better information on these things than governments do at the negotiation stage. Now, that's not a criticism of governments at all. It's just a function of the way the industry works, because it's investors that will have undertaken the exploration work and will have the data on the quality and quantity of the resources in the ground or in the field. It's the investors who will have done the detailed engineering work and will have a better understanding of investment costs and operating costs. And it's investors who have a good understanding of intangibles. So, for example, the intellectual property that they hold on extraction techniques or on different equipment and machinery that they'll use. So investors have better information, but they don't have perfect information. And as the guiding principles say, it's important that governments recognize that these are qualified estimates. They're not certain. And for that reason, it's really important that governments are able to do their own analysis using financial models so that they can look at multiple scenarios and understand how the benefits might be shared in different environments. And also to do things like estimate the cost of tax incentives, to see their impact on both commercial viability of a project and on government revenues, and to look at other important factors in terms of economic outcomes, social outcomes, and environmental outcomes. So it's really important that we share information in good faith so that governments are able to do this and we get more balanced deals. Now, the guiding principles draw an important distinction at this point between the oil and gas sector and the mining sector. In oil and gas, it's very common to have competitive bidding. And in doing so, governments can set in the tendering process the data requirements to ensure that they get the data they need, the feasibility studies, the financial models to make a proper assessment of a project. And actually, those competitive pressures almost compel the investors or the would-be investors to do that. Now, in mining, what you tend to find actually is you make much less use of competitive bidding and tendering processes. What you tend to find happens is the exploration company will have first rights almost to negotiate with the government to develop the asset. You therefore have a captive negotiation, and it becomes even more important, I think, that this information is shared with government because you don't have those competitive pressures to drive a good outcome. But also more difficult, I think, for governments to get that information because they can't use the tendering process as a tool to force and impel companies to provide the information. So this can be a lot more difficult to do in the mining sector than in oil and gas. Another important part of the guiding principles I'd like to sort of draw our attention to is on the quality of information that is shared with governments. And this is really important because I've seen investors share what they call a financial model with the government, but it's little more than a single sheet of Excel cash flow forecast. And that's not sufficient. What governments need to see and what the guiding principles say is the same level and frequency of data and information that is provided to lenders and that the investors themselves use in their own internal decision-making processes. And this is fundamental for governments to be able to do the analysis that they need to do to ensure that we get these balanced deals. And that's how you end up with this sort of shared understanding, this common ground, that we end up with a share of the benefits that both investors, host governments, and actually local communities too can accept, and that meets their legitimate interests. Now, Lara, you also asked about the asymmetry of information problem over the life cycle of a project. And if I might share sort of a few views on this slightly outside of the guiding principles. The first thing I'd say on this one is that it tends to be a different set of people in the companies and in government that will implement a project from those that were on the negotiating teams. And actually that's a bit of a shame, because what you tend to find in negotiations is you almost get a sort of bit of bonhomie between the parties and a good understanding and good relationships. And those that were in the room will understand the intent of the agreements and not just the written word of them. And that can help you down the line navigate difficult issues. And therefore, it's really important that both investors and governments properly hand over the project from the negotiating teams to those who will be responsible for the implementation of it. The second thing I would say during the life cycle of a project is that it's important for governments to set very clear and codified rules on what information and data should be shared by the companies and how frequently, and ideally to have that in legislation, but if not in legislation, at least to backstop using the contract so that all parties know the expectations and the requirements of reporting information and data, so that the government can do its job, its legitimate job, monitoring compliance with the contract and compliance with the rules and regulations of the country. And the third thing I'd say is actually both sides in long-term natural resource projects hate surprises. And surprises can undermine trust and they can really derail a project. So those sort of codified reporting requirements are necessary, but they're not usually sufficient. And what you need is you need lines of communication, be them political or informal, that can help the sides understand problems in advance and the intentions of the parties, so that we don't get surprises that can derail a project. I mean, those informal channels are really, really important and supplement the sort of formal regulatory requirements. So in summary, we know that we're dealing at the negotiation stage with a high degree of uncertainty. We don't know for certain the quality and quantity of resources, investment costs, the prices at which they're going to be sold. But the investors do generally have better information with governments. And as Guiding Principle 5 says, by sharing that information in full with governments, we can lead to more balanced agreements and more durable contracts. And in doing so, all parties will benefit from that. And I think Guiding Principle 5 is a really good grounding for this principle and really sets an important norm in contract negotiations in the extractive industries. Thank you, Lara.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I would like to follow up on this, on the points that you have made, that the development of mineral, oil and gas resources requires heavy upfront investments before production and is characterized by long lead times, high risk and uncertainty, as well as long payback periods, where initial investments are recouped after many years of production. And this brings us also to Guiding Principle 6, which notes how a sound investment and business climate, a reliable legal framework, and institutions upholding the rule of law are all critical factors for successful investment in the extractive industry, given the heavy upfront investments, long lead times, high risk and uncertainty that characterize extractive projects. So governments have a role to play in order to reduce both uncertainty and risk by having institutions that uphold the rule of law with transparency and integrity, and by providing fair, transparent, and clear regulations without unnecessary high costs of compliance. And transparency of the legal framework provides an important safeguard for foreign investors and should help ensure effective use of resources for public benefit. Governments also need to provide assurance on contract enforcement and property rights and the fairness, predictability, impartiality, and efficiency of the dispute resolution process, so that investors have confidence that their investment will not be unlawfully expropriated or otherwise impaired. And governments should ensure the clarity of administrative procedures, including by effectively coordinating activities among different ministries and agencies, as well as between the central and local governments. We also know that legal frameworks evolve over time, and one of the most sensitive issues we have dealt with while developing these guiding principles has been how to address non-fiscal changes in law. Let me now turn the floor to Howie, who will explain us the approach that we have collectively developed to address non-fiscal changes in law. Howie, the floor is yours. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lara and Mario and the Development Center for inviting me to participate in this session. And it's certainly true that the negotiation of the two principles, 7 and 8 on non-fiscal and fiscal stabilization were hard fought, fairly fought, but hard fought. And so I'm really delighted to be able to talk about Principle 7 on non-fiscal stabilization. I think to fully understand where we are now in terms of the achievements of these OECD guiding principles, it helps to take a short trip back in time to where we started. Our issue here is non-fiscal stabilization and how contracts should or shouldn't adjust for the reality that governments will, on an evolutionary basis, adopt new laws and regulations. The issue first arose in the context of John Ruggie's negotiation on the guiding principles on business and human rights. And in that process, there was a very important piece of research that was done that showed without question that the preponderance of non-fiscal stabilization clauses in investment contracts in the natural resource sector and other, but especially in natural resources, involve developing and least developed countries, and generally those with the least developed and least comprehensive legal regimes. In other words, those states that needed the policy space the most to develop their legal regimes were in fact those that were most likely to be deprived of that policy space by stabilization clauses with foreign investors. And following that research, there was a process to develop principles for responsible contracts as part of Ruggie's guiding principles or as an ancillary document. And principle 4 of those principles for responsible contract read, contractual stabilization clauses, if used, should be carefully drafted so that only any protections for investors against future changes in law do not interfere with the state's bona fide efforts to implement laws, regulations, or policies in a non-discriminatory manner in order to meet its human rights obligations. So in principle 4, you had a tie to human rights obligations, which was the focus of Ruggie's work. That in and of itself wasn't too bad because they took a fairly broad view of what human rights included. So that was kind of, the scope of that was fudged over a little bit. But the differences come when you look in the commentary, and one of the first notes in the commentary there was that it is legitimate for investors to seek protection against arbitrary or discriminatory changes in law. And that notion of arbitrary and discriminatory becomes really critical. because they go on to note that stabilization clauses that freeze laws applicable to the project really should not be used, at least not if they impact the state's capacity to achieve their human rights obligations. They also go on in Ruggies' document to address the use of economic equilibrium provisions on non-fiscal stabilization. And there they say very clearly that stabilization clauses, if used, should not contemplate economic or other penalties for states in the event that it introduces new laws. But it then goes on to tie that to reflect international standards, benchmarks, or recognized good practices, especially in the health, safety, labor, and environment area, and again ties it back to human rights. So there's a tension in the Ruggie context as to just what the legitimate role of stabilization clauses is and where that legitimate role ends in respect of government obligations to respect and protect human rights and investor obligations to respect human rights. The OECD guidelines, and I think this is the 2015 or 2016 revision, itself follows that part of the debate on stabilization and says investors should refrain from seeking or accepting exemptions not contemplated in the statutory or regulatory framework related to human rights, environmental, health, safety, labor, taxation, and so on. So the OECD guidelines pick up the issue and move the ball a little bit further down the track in terms of questioning the legitimacy of non-fiscal stabilization rules or contract provisions. And that passage I just read is quoted in the commentary to these new OECD guiding principles and Principle 7 in particular. So I want to come to Principle 7. Is it on the screen? I'm reading from some notes. If you can put Principle 7 on the screen, please, that would help. Great. So I want to just parse through it quickly. Durable extractive contracts, and here's the first key point, are consistent with applicable laws. What this simple, very simple initial sentence really says is the contract should not depart from the applicable law in each host country. The contracts can add to it, they can define certain applications to it, but they shouldn't change the law. Contracts should not be used to create bespoke legal regimes that are inconsistent with the applicable law on a project by project basis. So that becomes an important starting point here. And then it goes on, consistent with applicable laws, applicable international and regional treaties, that's fine. And anticipate that host governments may introduce bona fide, non-arbitrary, and non-discriminatory changes in laws. In other words, from the beginning, the assumption should be that governments will do that. And that is to be expected as a normal part of government operation as political interests change, as political relationships change, and as economic relationships between different economic actors change over the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year lifespan of a natural resource project. So it should be expected, it should be built into the understanding of the economics of the project. And here we talk about covering non-fiscal regulatory areas to pursue legitimate public interest objectives. It's not limited to environmental laws or labor laws. It covers the broader suite of government regulatory actions that one normally sees. So when we look at that, what we see as the starting point is really the opposite of the notion of stabilization. We see a recognition that governments will and should be enabled and not prevented from taking new regulatory measures and applying them to all investors. The quid pro quo for that, if I can put it that way, is the cost attributable to compliance with changes in law should be treated as other project costs for the purposes of tax deductibility and cost recovery. And what this really means is what are often simply treated, or what are oftentimes treated only as capital costs with what could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year depreciation periods, costs of compliance with new laws can be moved or treated as operational costs. And so the cost recovery from a tax perspective is in the same year that the costs occurred. So it can be much quicker for the investors to allocate the cost for tax deductibility purposes. And that's part of the balancing that was reached.
Howie, may I ask you a follow-up question? Since you've mentioned the costs associated with the changes in law that might be introduced by governments, do you think that these guiding principles are relevant for dealing with new requirements related to climate change that may be introduced by governments and that may have an impact on extractive contracts?
Yes and no, Lara. I think these principles go a long way to address climate change adaptation issues, making sure that standards are in place to prevent weather-related events having catastrophic impacts on natural resource projects and local communities, making sure water is protected and so on, those kinds of adaptive measures. Where the issue gets a little bit more tricky is in the context of climate change mitigation measures, especially in the areas of oil, gas, and coal, and related subsectors like dealing with pipelines that transport oil and gas and so on. Because here the investment is specifically in climate damaging products. And governments will, over the next years, certainly within most of our lifetimes, if not all of our lifetimes, hopefully, measures will need to be taken by governments that effectively make these investments sunset investments. And that sunset period might be very short in some cases. But this goes to the core of the reason for making the investments, not just regulating it to prevent externalities. The harm is in the intended product itself. And so I think in that context, while these provisions go a long way down the road to legitimize government measures in addressing those issues, there's still an additional risk because the core element is related to the harm being done, the core element of the investment. And I think there's also an additional risk under investment treaties, given the vagaries of the investor-state dispute settlement process. So I think while these provisions help in the context of contracts, especially in the oil and gas and coal sectors, I think it would be helpful. I shouldn't say there needs to be, but I think it would be very helpful to have a full expression of the right of governments to regulate closures in those areas, either complete or partial shutdowns of those businesses. And if you like, I can put into the chat afterwards a link to a provision that I helped negotiate into a gas contract, the purchase of a gas contract between a Canadian company and the state of Maryland, that actually addresses straight on the risks of the investor using NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement investment provisions, to object to climate change measures that would reduce the volume of business or even eliminate the business. And these provisions were accepted by the company and effectively foreclose any use of the investor-state dispute settlement process to protect the state's ability to regulate on climate change. So that's why I say the answer is yes and no, Lara.
Thank you, Harry. And in my view, I think beyond the case of that you brought, the extreme case of projects being shut down, I think this provision can also help in sharing the costs related to the deployment of clean technologies that can reduce, for instance, the impact on the carbon footprint of oil and gas projects in particular. But I think this would deserve another dedicated DevTalk, perhaps the next one in the series related to the guiding principles. In the interest of time, let me move to the challenge, one of the most important challenge that investors and governments need to address when negotiating extractive contracts, and namely the fact that this contracts and the associated projects are likely to operate through several economic cycles and are likely to experience booms, but also periods of economic stress and loss. So I'd like to hear from Anna, how can contracts be designed to provide for the fair sharing of value through all stages of the project life cycle and across a range of outcomes and ongoing market conditions in order to avoid chasing after prices, as we all know that this has resulted in strained relationships between governments and investors. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. That's already a boon. So thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this presentation. And in view of your question, Lara, it's probably helpful to have to elaborate a little bit or introduce a little bit the principle 8, because that's what it deals with. Principle 8, what is it about? It's basically, it explains how fiscal terms in contracts and the interactions of contracts with the fiscal legislation of a country are relevant aspects that contribute to the durability of extractive contracts. And so it's not only how some of these fiscal terms can deal with the economic cycles, but also how basically the interaction of the terms in contract with existing legislation and how the contract itself can be set that contributes to the durability, because it doesn't mean that the external stages or the external situations change, that therefore necessarily your contract should be able to deal with some of these things. And the guiding principle and the comments to it basically outline aspects of how fiscal terms and these interactions can go through that. Now, in order to do that, it's important to understand when the principle talks about fiscal terms and the fiscal systems, what is it talking about? Fiscal terms are a set of rules that define the government shares from a contract dealing with extractives. And the comment to the principle explained that the fiscal system refers to very often a combination of general tax law, so general law that is already pre-exists, sometimes added sector-specific law, and then in a lot of cases you have the project-specific arrangements that very often are set in contracts. So different instruments that will interact with each other, not all available for change at the time. So various instruments There are also various methodologies to achieve and to assure that you have clarity on your fiscal system. Now, the main types are a concession agreements, which are commonly used both for mining and oil and gas. And the primary instruments under these systems are royalty contributions and taxes. But there's also production sharing contracts, PSAs. They are commonly used in oil and gas, and they basically outline in general the way the production is shared between the state and the investor. But also they very often introduce or regulate additional instruments like royalties and taxes, or clarify the interaction with existing taxes. And then there are service agreements which are a lot simpler and generally don't include a lot of specific fiscal legislation. So there, the interaction between existing legislation is again more important. So various instrument that needs to be managed. And in addition, compared to your general profit taxation, fiscal terms tend to feature differences in tax-based differentiation to reflect the differences in geology, location, and other risks that exists on production projects on the one hand, and the significant variation between cost and revenue generation throughout the life of a single project. And therefore, if we look at what the principle is trying to achieve, is in the end, an efficient, predictable, and stable fiscal term and fiscal regime is going to be conducive to incentivize long-term investment and to reduce disputes. And so the principle outlines what is considered to strive that. Now, it is the government's mandate to decide what an appropriate level of tax is and how to determine their tax policies accordingly. But for oil and gas and for extractives in general, that is basically not always that easy, because various things need to be balanced. It's been mentioned in previous principles. It's also applicable in this one. The durability of your fiscal terms is served by considering upfront what you're trying to achieve, what you're going to be up against, what you're going to be expecting from the project, and what you're going to be expecting from the share of it. Because if you don't know in advance, if the government doesn't know, and if the investor doesn't know, then it's very hard to basically have an informed discussion and achieve a balance that will not only be durable between the parties, but also because you're talking about tax revenue and fiscal revenue and government share from finite resources. It's important that governments can explain what they're doing towards their constituencies. So it's important to consider their own their internal economic and fiscal objectives, but also considering international laws and treaties need to be taken into account. While it is the right of a country to be able to change their laws and regulations, it needs to be in alignment with global and regional agreements and treaties. So upfront consideration of the objective allows a more informed choice and a balance between the various requirements and a choice of instruments. So they need to consider not only what terms to apply for new contracts, but you also need to consider the existing legislation that is in place. Very often, from a fiscal point of view, it's important to consider that not only a federal government has taxing rights, but also subnational levels. So the principle outlines how that can be balanced as well. And very typical for extractive industries, whereas fiscal terms for, in general, largely get set by Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, for extractive fiscal terms, the input and the considerations need to be considered and balanced. What comes from ministries of energy, from mining, environment, and administration as well. Now, what are they trying to avoid? In order for contracts to be durable, What you want to avoid is non-coordinated unilateral actions from all parties. But with respect to the fiscal terms, legislative actions that go above and beyond international consensus that are introduced without consideration and consultation, because such uncertainty will have an impact, a negative impact on investment, on foreign investment, and on jobs. So basically, then if you look at considering, the cycles that you mentioned, Lara, what is the principle sets out various factors that could be inducive to this this durability. First of all, there needs to be consistency with overall economic and fiscal objectives that the government has. So not only do they need to have clarity about it themselves, but it also needs to consider that basically, depending on the political and the social developments and the status, the state that a country is in, resource-rich countries may be seeking to achieve different objectives with their policies. So, for example, in the early years of a development, it could be relevant that there is a focus on opening up acreage, on seeking to decrease the high risk that still exists around the exploration of the activity. So if you're dealing with new provinces, then the terms may need to be pitched to achieve that objective. Once an acreage is de-risked, or you have a better view, parties have a better view of the geological play in place, then the focus may switch to maximizing early revenues for the government, and also to fund social development programs, etc. And then again, in mature oil and gas provinces, governments may be more focused on maximizing their ultimate economic recovery from a basin, and then basically working the limited windows of opportunity to ensure that, or the closing window of opportunity to ensure that infrastructure and resources are maximized. Throughout the life cycle, then the host government may also want to increase jobs and develop domestic competencies. So there, considerations of local content may come into place. And whichever way the objective is considered, specific requirements will be put to your fiscal terms. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to have to unilaterally change them if you deal with different objectives. So it's best to consider them upfront and to basically see how you deal with some of these issues. So for example, what you can do is you can have different license rounds or change acreages in the later stages, or make responsive terms. So, for example, where the deals or the terms can respond to, for example, if the price goes up, or that you have a progressive rate that moves a royalty system, for example, up and achieves more sharing when the price goes down or when the volume increases, or that there is a rate that depends on the resource quality, for example. That all can be set in contracts, and which will contribute to the fact that countries or parties to the contract don't end up unhappy with the terms and the results and the revenues that they are getting from their investment. So what needs to be considered also in the end is that revenue generation for the resource holder is an important factor, because the fiscal regime, that's what it's about. It's ensuring equal shares. But it is about dealing with the risk reward. So the risks are going to be considered, are going to have to be allocated in advance. And the particularity around the fiscal risk is basically that whereas investing companies often are used to dealing with risk around subsurface the cost, the oil price, they are less comfortable with shouldering fiscal uncertainties, because fiscal uncertainties are often determined by the country, and therefore is not something that is basically where there's a lot of oversight, and so the vision of fiscal risk is therefore a bit more particular than the risk alignment or the risk reward division that Howard talked about in the previous principle. Now, as far as this guiding principle, it's very relevant that these discussions have taken place, that the guiding principles have come out, that they've been the result of multi-stakeholder engagements, because in order to achieve balance, transparency is key, both in the process of achieving the agreement, but also in understanding, for example, of the use of the funds that are going to be generating through the developments. And in order for the guiding principles to really deliver all of their potential, then the efforts need to come from all the stakeholders, and it's important that governments and investors continue a strong and constructive dialogue.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this comprehensive recollection of the complexities related to the design of the fiscal regimes and the negotiation of fiscal terms, which shows that there is no one ideal fiscal regime that can be applied under all circumstances, but the emphasis of the guiding principles on the responsiveness of fiscal terms is designed to achieve this alignment of interests across governments and investors, and ensure a fair sharing of the benefits. You have also touched upon a key term, transparency. I'd like to recall that in the preamble to the guiding principles, there is a recognition of the importance of public disclosure of future signed contracts, and that the parties should anticipate that during the negotiation process, the public disclosure of future signed contracts in accordance with international good practice, with due regard taken to both protecting proprietary or commercially sensitive information and the public interest in transparency. Agreeing to publish contracts adds an important dimension of ex post accountability to negotiation processes, and can help ensure that the contractual terms are able to withstand public and commercial scrutiny. On this note, I would like to call on Monsieur Okoko to elaborate on how the guiding principles can help explain extractive contracts to the public and support contract disclosure under the AITI and other extractive transparency initiatives, in particular with respect to the implementation of the requirement for extractive contract transparency, which is now included in the 2018 EITI standard. Monsieur Okoko, vous avez la parole. And there is
thank you. Thank you very much, Lara. I will appreciate very much that I would be associated to this very important project, and the EITI as well. Okay, I will speak in French. I would like to say to everybody that I will speak in French, so that they took the time to change, to took the interpretation, the according interpretation. Okay. Je vais m'exprimer donc en français.
So, I hope the translation is coming through loud and clear. Let me just say that as part of these guiding principles, there's one principle which reflects EITI as a process, guiding principle number 6, where this concept of transparency is clearly presented. On January 1st, 2021, all member states implementing EITI are required to disclose the contents of their contracts. And this is important because disclosing such contracts as part of the EITI standard, which is a governance standard for extractive industries, all the way from the granting of rights to the marketing of products. Transparency there and disclosure makes it possible for all stakeholders, of course, host countries, but also the industry and civil society, makes it possible for all stakeholders to have reliable and relevant information to be able to see that all the terms and conditions regarding in particular payments are properly implemented. And so that is the main aspect of that framework. So when a contract is publicly disclosed, well, when contracts are disclosed, it's easier to compare them, to examine them, to see to what extent they're properly implemented. And companies can see how they contribute to the national economy. They can see their contributions to tax revenue in particular. And so, and this is important because, well, governments need to have a set of fair rules and if there is such a fair framework, well, then companies and governments negotiating contracts have an incentive in their talks to look after such aspects as well, national development and public interest. And there we find that there's a convergence of interest between what is being done through disclosing contracts and what is being done as part of the guiding principles we are considering right now. Now, as part of the guiding principles, we are working with long-term projects and indeed, well, in most cases, in the extractive industries, we're looking at long-term projects. And so there is a clear need to have a balanced position, recognizing that the host country should be in a position to exploit its natural resources, but communities and citizens at large should be able to take to benefit from that. But of course, the company, the investor, should also be rewarded for for its effort and investment. And so you need to strike a right balance for the host country, and the host country is providing natural resources, but there are environmental consequences, social consequences as well. So you have to look at communities to see what the social or environmental impact might be. And so you have to look at the whole picture. So there's a risk run by the companies. Well, there's also a risk run by the host countries as well. Well, they have to come to terms with that, and that is why it is essential to have transparency. That is why it is important to disclose contracts, so you can see clearly that there is the right balance. Now, the states themselves are those that can ensure that there's transparency. I mean, it is for them to guarantee that the contracts are properly implemented. They also are those who can ensure that that public administration is abiding by the law, that all the provisions are duly applied. And so the guiding principles that we have, especially guiding principle number 6, have, well, reconcile the interests of all the stakeholders as part of the disclosing effort and when these contracts are being implemented. And I think this will go some way towards meeting the needs of all stakeholders, not just the hosts, but all those at the EITI that are involved. And so you have civil society, you have governments, but of course industry, all stakeholders are paying interest to the way in which these guiding principles are being put forward and implemented. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Okoko.
Already how these guiding principles can be used by different stakeholders and how they can be useful in shaping durable extractive contracts. So this provides us with a nice link to our last intervener, Peter Leone. I apologize if we are running late. And bear with us if we have time. We will address also the questions that were raised in the chat. We'll run until 1:45 if you are willing to stay. So Peter, you have extensive experience in advising on resource regulatory issues across sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the negotiation and implementation of major mine development agreements. So we would like to hear from you as a practitioner, how the guiding principles can assist the resource-rich developing countries and investors in getting better deals. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important meeting. I really think the guiding principles are a game changer for mining companies, for investors in mining, for host states, and for mine communities. And doing the work I do around Anglophone Africa over the last number of years, I've really come to appreciate, and Howie and I actually worked on a project for the International Bar Association about 10 years ago called the Model Mine Development Agreement, which tried to do this in the wake of the renegotiation by the DRC of all its concession agreements, which was a very fraught process. So the IBA asked us to try and come up with a model agreement which investors and host states could use for their concession agreements. But that is some time ago, and that agreement obviously needs updating. What's happened in the last number of years, and I've worked on this in a number of African countries, is you've had a combination of resource nationalism, sometimes driven by political factors where mining companies are sometimes a scapegoat for a government which finds itself in political trouble, where its predecessors negotiated deals which were not fair to the host state. Or you have the situation in a number of African countries, not unique to Africa, but in fact quite common in the developing world, where the fiscal regime doesn't respond properly to changes in commodity prices. As you know, the commodity cycles are very cyclical. We went through a commodity boom up until 2014, which then imploded. We may be back in some respects, if you look at iron ore and copper and things like that, even zinc, at a spike in commodity prices now, driven by China. So what I've seen in a number of resource-rich African countries is changes to the rules of the game where an investment is already sunk. I want to refer to two specific recent examples. One, the work I did for a number of years in Tanzania for a gold mining company, where the government basically tore up the mineral regulatory regime in response to what they thought was tax evasion, base erosion, and the unlawful export of gold by Acacia Mining, which was majority owned by Barrick. And I worked on that for Acacia for a number of years. And there, effectively, the government changed the law in a one-week process in Parliament, where the companies were given 1 day to make their views known, where the government effectively banned recourse to international arbitration, banned the use of international bank accounts, banned the export of unprocessed minerals, and imposed a free state carry on all mining companies, which was anywhere between 16 and potentially 50%, depending on the regime you had in place. Then they introduced an Unconscionable Terms Act into the changes to the mining law, which basically said that the Parliamentary Committee on Mining could force a mining company to change the terms of its mineral development agreement if those terms were unconscionable, and the terms are written in such broad terms that could mean anything. And if there wasn't agreement between the mining company and the government or the parliamentary committee, within 90 days, the terms were deemed to be expunged. So that's a pretty extreme example by John Magufuli's administration in reaction to what they saw was a bad deal for the government, for gold mining companies coming to the country in the wake of the privatization process that President Mkapa launched in the early 1990s. Then another example, and I'll come to talk a little bit about South Africa very briefly, where I'm based. Another example, more recent example, is Zambia, where the government, obviously Zambia is Africa's second biggest copper producer after the DRC. The government has introduced numerous changes to the fiscal regime, which is making it increasingly difficult for copper mining companies to invest. What they've done there effectively is double royalty rates, not pay mining companies VAT refunds, which are now in the region of about $1 billion. Prior to the changes to tax laws about 3 years ago, mineral royalties were always deductible from corporate income tax. They no longer are. So effectively, companies are taxed twice. And that, you know, companies like First Quantum and DRM have now said, well, if that's the case, the billions of dollars investment that we're going to put into Zambia are not going to happen. Then a more extreme example, which I've been directly involved in, is the case of Vedanta, where the government wasn't happy with the way in which Vedanta ran Konkola Copper Minerals, which it owns 80% of, 20% is owned by the state mining company. So last May, after the government lost an election on the copper belt, the state mining company put Konkola Copper Mines into provisional liquidation on the grounds that it was just and equitable to do so, because the government felt that the company hadn't been paying its suppliers, had lost its social license, and so on. That process is now the subject of a shareholders' arbitration and also to litigation in the Zambian courts. But I think both those examples, which are, you know, frankly pretty extreme, show what host states will, what lengths they will go to, where they think that the agreements which were entered into previously were not fair and balanced. And that's why I think, Lara, the guiding principles are game changer, because what they try to do, I think really for the first time, is set a set of principles which are fair and balanced and try to restore trust between mining companies, mining investors, and host states, which frankly has not been the case. And the work I've done in Africa is all really because the government hasn't trusted the mining company, hasn't trusted the investors. I just want to make one final point around communities, because that's one of the things that the guiding principles try to address. And I'm also doing some work now, a very interesting work in Saudi Arabia, helping the Saudi government with their complete reform of their mineral law regime. And it's very interesting, Saudi Arabia, which is a developing country in terms of mining, that the government is so conscious of the needs of mine communities. But just on the issue of communities, thing that has bothered me, we've obviously seen this in the case of Rio Tinto in Australia, and it's very interesting today, the Senate in Australia has come out with a pretty scathing report about Rio's conduct in relation to the destruction of the Juukan Gorge in Western Australia. But just on the issue of communities, I mean, South Africa probably had, 20 years ago, the most developed mining code amongst African countries. Yet the one thing the South African government has never really addressed are the needs properly of mining communities. So social and labor plans are negotiated between mining companies and the government, the Department of Mineral Resources, but they don't need the consent of the communities for those plans. So what's happened is the communities have had to take the government to court, have had to bring access to information requests to the government, in order to see what a company's mining right says. And that, to my mind, that is completely unfair, because if you're going to have, if you're going to look after the interests of mine communities need to know what the mining right says, how they are affected by that. And I know we're all a long way away from free, prior, and informed consent, which some countries do have. And in fact, the ECOWAS mining directive in West Africa actually has as a fundamental principle. But what I would urge, and I think is a very important issue, is that communities, that it is absolutely mandatory for communities to be properly and fully consulted about issues which affect them. If they're not, frankly, that has huge impacts on a mining company's social license and makes life, in fact, extremely difficult for the mining company, even if they haven't been at fault in the entire process. So I know those are some fairly brief remarks, but in the interest of time, I wanted to make them as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is highly appreciated, and in particular, we could not conclude with better words for the guiding principles, as you have indicated, then describe them as a game changer. I'd like to give the opportunity to our speakers to address the questions that were raised in the chat, and in particular the political, how to deal with political interference when implementing guiding principle 3, and also the issue always related to communities, consultation and engagement, and the issue related to the fact that communities that with the most at stake in extractive projects are not necessarily those that are geographically nearest to the site of the project. I was wondering whether, Sally, you would be willing to address these questions, and please feel also free, Jan, Howie, and Anna, to jump in if you so wish. We are running rather late, so I'd appreciate a short reaction, and then I will wrap up and conclude with a few words. Thank you very much.
Okay, look, I think it's another question as well that said, when you have a weak government, how do you protect local communities? So I'll speak to both of those. And in fact, you put your finger, both of you, on the real issue here, which is what to do when the government, the national government, is either too weak or is just not doing what I identified as its role earlier when I talked about principles 2, 3, and 4, which is to look at the development goals and to consult the local communities when doing so. Setting development goals should be an independent mission of the government, irrespective of what projects it may be tendering for. But I think in particular with regard to extractives, the idea that the government has a huge responsibility here must be underlined. And I take Peter's point when he refers to the West Africa and the French-speaking community, or used to be French-speaking community, because it is so important to have a legislative framework to support the rights of the communities. Now, I will say something that I hope will not be offensive to my industrial friends who are maybe still on the call, including Anna and ExxonMobil, and I think I saw Total. If you find yourself tendering or not tendering for projects that are in countries that do have weak governments, I think it would behoove the industry and the investor to make a special effort here to make sure that the interests of the local communities and whatever historical sites may be affected are taken into consideration, even if It has to be the investor or the operating companies or the consortium that brings this issue to bear on the negotiations. And the reason I say this is it will come back to bite you if you don't. And I think although one could understand the point of view that says, this is not my problem, this is a government problem. And if the government is not doing its job, then I am not in a position to take over here. Well, I see that, I understand that, but I think in the interest of a long-term project, meaning 20, 30 years and with a long life cycle, I think it would be good to understand that if something blows up and if it looks like the national government is, excuse the expression, selling the local communities down the river, then I think as good business people, it makes sense to look into this problem, even if strictly legally speaking, the balance is not your responsibility, because if you don't do this, and if you ignore the problem, or if you don't even look into whether there will be a problem, then I think that this will cause for very unstable grounds for a balancing between the interests of all the communities. So although I understand the reticence and the potential liability as an attorney, I think it is something that the parties need to discuss very, very early in the conception of the project, because otherwise the two people that wrote in the comments, you're right, there will be a problem. And who's going to deal with it once that happens? Everyone is going to be affected, and the project will not go as smoothly as one would hope. So that's what I would like to answer to those two questions, and I will deactivate my mic. Lara?
Thank you very much, Sally. And indeed, the commentary to Guiding Principle 3 also recommends that the provisions in the Guiding Principle can help fill any gaps under national law in order to address the issues that sooner or later are likely to arise. So here we're not strictly speaking about legal risk, accountability and responsibility, but more broadly of what needs to be done in order to avoid problems down the road. Unless our invited speakers would like to say anything at this stage, I see no sign. I would also, because we are abused of your time today, we are running late. So let me just conclude with a few remarks. I think the discussion today and the comments we received have clearly shown that far from settling on the lowest common denominator, the guiding principles are a forward-looking tool. They aim to facilitate a common understanding between the parties to the contract about how to approach difficult aspects of their relationship, showing how tensions can be overcome and contentious issues dealt with during the negotiations. The recommended approaches are intended to maintain an alignment of interests throughout the life cycle of the extractive projects, reflecting a balance of risks and rewards shared by governments, investors, and communities. By endorsing the guiding principles, the governing board of the OECD Development Center recognized the importance, relevance, and the impact of this tool, expressing its political support for their use in the negotiation of durable extractive contracts. I'd like to join the chair of the governing board, Ambassador Escudero, in expressing the wish that the guiding principles will become a common reference for the negotiation of enduring and sustainable extractive contracts, leading to improved development outcomes. Let me also thank all the speakers who have accepted our invitation to disseminate and publicize the guiding principles that are available online, as you know. And let me announce the next DevTalk, which will take place next Wednesday, the 16th of December, just after the Development Center's LAC Forum. which will provide the opportunity to discuss a very important article that will be published by the Groupe d'études de géopolitique in Le Grand Continent, focusing on the relation between Latin America and Europe. So thank you very much for staying with us, and let's hope that these guiding principles will really be a game changer, as Peter put it. Thank you very much. Bye.